Now, I don't know if it's just me, and it might just be, because I'm not the smartest person in the world, but sometimes the Bible is kind of confusing. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but this is how I end up feeling when I'm looking at the Bible, and sometimes it boggles my mind whenever I see people that want to act like, well, the Bible's so obvious. You just kind of read it and, you do what it says, and then everything's very simple. It's all black and white. Because you read the Bible, and it's full of all these things that honestly don't seem to make sense. I mean, you even see things in the life of Jesus. So, not even talking about the obscure things in the Old Testament, but in the life of Jesus, where he says things that you kind of stop and you say, well, what does that mean? I mean, how does that fit into anything else that's been said throughout this entire book? Well, one of these areas where I think we end up getting tripped up is when it comes to a sense of hardness or callousness that can pop up in our hearts. In particular, when we start thinking that we have everything all figured out, and then God ends up going, okay, fine, you think you got it figured out? Then go do it your own way. I'm going to go somewhere else. It's a kind of a weird concept because we're so used to thinking of God and religion in terms of, how many followers we have and how many people are in a church building or how many individuals show up at some kind of big conference or maybe respond to some altar call at a workshop or a student event or a summer camp. Numbers are such a big part of how we experience religion, but the reality is that is very much not the way that Christ led his own ministry, and it's not what we see throughout the entirety of the Bible. God chooses to use people who are not necessarily the biggest and the strongest and the smartest and the holiest acting, but instead he uses individuals whose hearts are softened and ready to receive the truth that God is going to speak to them. Now, just to kind of start out this conversation, one of the things I'd like to look at is a story back in Exodus. And just to kind of set the stage very briefly, if you don't recall, what ends up happening in Exodus is you have Moses, he's raised up by God to go and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And time again, Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to do that. And so as a result, there's these several plagues. Well, eventually we end up seeing this moment where we see that Moses once again says, Pharaoh, you need to let God's people go, because if you don't let God's people go, then God has said that there will be an angel of death and there will be a death throughout your land of the firstborn. And the way it's translated in most of our Bibles is that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, what does that mean? I mean, that almost sounds like God set Pharaoh up for failure if God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But what we actually end up seeing is that Pharaoh first chose to harden his own heart. In your groups, what you're going to do is you're going to see a few of these examples about where Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And so what you end up actually getting when you zoom out on this story is a picture of a God who isn't picking and choosing who is and is not going to listen to him, but instead looks at us and says, you can choose to have a soft heart or you can choose to have a hardened heart. And if you choose to have a softened heart, then you could do things the way I say. And if not, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. So if you choose to harden your heart, then you know what? I'm not going to beg you to come along with my plan. And fine, you can have things your way. That is both kind of a freeing thought to know that God doesn't treat us like robots, but it's also an utterly terrifying thought to think that God would actually look at what we say about what we really feel in our own hearts and know that if we want to choose a path that ultimately leads to our own destruction, then he's going to let us have that. Now, I know I just started that out by talking about Pharaoh, and sometimes when we hear these lessons, we can think that they're really talking about individuals who are maybe what we'd call seekers, or people who don't really have a relationship with God yet and are just poking around it, or maybe it's for people who are kind of outside the church and living those horrible, sinful lifestyles. But the reality is that this is extremely true for the people that are inside of the church. You end up seeing this in how God treats the Pharisees, the individuals who are kind of the perennial bad guys of the New Testament. Well, they weren't really the bad guys. In reality, the Pharisees, if you were to look at modern times, are people that would be considered like the fundamentalist Bible thumpers. They were the individuals that would consider themselves the true believers, the individuals who are the true, they wouldn't say born again, but the true born again Christians of their time. They knew the scriptures, they knew the Bible as they had it, and they tried to follow it letter to the law exactly as they felt it was supposed to be implemented. And so as a result of that, everybody looked at them as if they were the holiest of holy people. But Jesus saw through to their hearts. He understood that even though these individuals may appear like they are holy, they may appear like they are educated, like they have status and they have authority, Jesus knew that their hearts were hardened to the truth that he was there to communicate. And as a result of that, he would oftentimes choose to target individuals that were complete opposites of the Pharisees. In fact, we actually end up seeing in the life of Christ him explain why he chose to use parables to explain so many lessons. He did it so that people who were really there to receive the message and had softened hearts would hear and would understand. And yet all those individuals who were just kind of sitting on the side ready to judge wouldn't really be able to understand things. It's kind of smart if you think about it. It's almost like God knows how we think and how we act, and so he chose to talk to us in a way that we would understand. Well, this is one of those things that you end up seeing throughout the Bible, is how God doesn't necessarily jump at the opportunity to target individuals who think of themselves as being especially close to God. And he also doesn't jump at using individuals who the rest of society would look at and say, those are, especially holy people. Instead, he uses people whose hearts are open, whose ears are listening for God talking truth into their lives. Ironically, even sometimes those individuals are people that we would look at as pagans who have no business listening to God. But yet, God sees through the words and the figures that they talk about, and he knows when a heart is ready to receive him. And when he knows that heart is there, he will speak to it and he will call on it. When I look across the entire Bible, here's what I see. God finding individuals who were, to our eyes, incredibly flawed, the most unlikely characters to bring his will to fruition, and yet looking into their hearts, seeing that their hearts were ready to receive his word, and then using them to do miraculous things. He used Noah, but Noah was a drunk. He used Abraham, but Abraham was a pagan. He used Moses, but Moses was a hothead. He used David, but David was a womanizer. He used Matthew, even though Matthew was a liar and a cheat. He used Paul, even though Paul was a murderer. And when I look at how God was able to use all of these people, I look at my own life and the own hang-ups that I carry, the things that keep me from doing what God is calling me to do, and I say, what excuse do I have? And what thing do I have in my life that I think means that God just needs to wait? What do I have that I feel that I need to straighten out first, or that I need to experience first, or that I need to take care of before I'm willing to actually do what God is calling me to do? God doesn't need us, but God does want us. And as a result of that, God looks at our hearts and he says, I know you may not feel you're ready, but I can make you ready. I know you may feel that there are things that you need to do or that you want to experience, or there's things you're not ready to give up, but I am here to give you the strength and to show you that you can do without whatever this world has said that you need. I am all that you need. All I require is for your heart to be receptive, for your heart to not grow callous. But the danger is there, just as we've seen in so many of these other examples, that if we allow our hearts to grow callous, maybe God will say, fine, have it your way. I won't use you. I'll stop calling you and you can keep doing things your own way. And I shudder to think of what the consequences of that decision are. And so the lesson for us here today is to look into our own hearts and to ask ourselves, what is it that is in our lives that we are permitting to allow our hearts to grow callous? And what do we need to do to soften our own hearts so that we can be receptive to what God is calling us to do? That's our lesson that we have for you here today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.